The moon hung low over the horizon, its reflection shimmering across the still surface of Lake Huron. Nathan's cabin sat nestled among the dense pines, the porch light barely piercing the vast darkness. He had chosen this life of isolation for the quiet and escape from the noise of the world. As a meteorologist, he spent his days immersed in storm data, tracking patterns that danced unpredictably across the skies. But tonight, the stillness was different, uneasy, like the world was holding its breath. It started with a streak of light cutting violently across the heavens. Nathan, leaning back on his weathered wooden chair with a mug of cooling tea, froze as the light intensified. At first, it was a familiar sight, a meteor, perhaps, but then the streak curved unnaturally, an impossible motion for any celestial object. The light flared brighter, bathing the forest in an eerie, golden glow, before vanishing with a soundless pulse that seemed to ripple through the air. The silence returned, but now it was alive, buzzing with tension. Nathan grabbed his flashlight, his pulse quickening. He didn't believe in UFOs or the supernatural, but his instincts urged him to investigate. He navigated the narrow path through the woods, boots crunching against dry leaves, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the oppressive darkness. The air felt charged, heavy with an electric hum, as though the forest itself was trembling in anticipation. When he reached the lake, his breath caught. A sleek, crystalline object lay half submerged in the water, its surface iridescent, shifting colors like oil on water. Shards of luminous material floated around it, casting soft glows that painted the surrounding trees in ethereal hues. Steam rose from the pod's surface, hissing softly as it cooled. This was no earthly craft. Nathan knew that immediately. His heart pounded, a mix of fear and curiosity surging through him. As he approached, the water rippled. A figure emerged from the wreckage, stumbling onto the shore. Nathan's flashlight caught her face, and he gasped. She wasn't human, at least not entirely. Her features were strikingly delicate, with high cheekbones and eyes that seemed too large, too luminous, like twin galaxies swirling with violet and silver. Her skin glowed faintly, almost imperceptibly, and intricate, vein-like patterns shimmered beneath the surface. Her hair, impossibly long and silken, cascaded around her, reflecting the faint light like liquid starlight. She collapsed to her knees, her breath ragged. Instinct took over, and Nathan rushed forward, his fear momentarily eclipsed by concern. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice trembling. She flinched, her eyes darting to him, wide with panic. She spoke, her words melodic but incomprehensible, a language that sounded like wind chimes in a storm. She raised a trembling hand, palm outward, as though warning him to stay back. Nathan stopped, raising his hands in a gesture of peace. "It's okay," he said softly, his voice steadying. "I'm not going to hurt you." Her gaze locked onto his, and for a moment it felt as if time had stopped. Nathan felt something he couldn't explain, as if her presence reached into the deepest corners of his mind and pulled at something primal, something ancient and unspoken. Her eyes softened, and she lowered her hand, swaying slightly before collapsing onto the damp sand. Nathan hesitated, then crouched beside her, careful not to startle her again. Up close, she seemed impossibly fragile, her form too perfect, too otherworldly to belong to this world. Her breathing was shallow, and a faint, silvery fluid trickled from a wound on her arm. Without thinking, Nathan removed his jacket and wrapped it around her, his fingers brushing her cold, smooth skin. She stirred, her lips parting as she whispered something. Though he couldn't understand the words, the plea in her voice was unmistakable. "I've got you," Nathan said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You're safe now." He lifted her into his arms, surprised by how light she was, as if her body was made of something less dense than flesh and bone. The warmth of his jacket seemed to calm her, and she nestled closer to his chest, her breathing evening out slightly. Nathan began the trek back to his cabin, the weight of what had just happened pressing down on him. Questions swirled in his mind, but he pushed them aside. Right now, all that mattered was keeping her alive. When they reached the cabin, he laid her gently on the couch, covering her with a blanket. The soft glow from her skin illuminated the room, casting faint, shifting patterns on the walls. Nathan sat on the floor beside her, his back against the couch, staring at her in disbelief. Who or what was she? And why was she here? He glanced at the wound on her arm, unsure of how to treat it. The silvery fluid seemed to coagulate on its own, forming a delicate, crystalline scab. Hours passed, and the night deepened. Nathan dozed fitfully, jolting awake at every small sound. Each time he looked at her, his mind struggled to process what his eyes were seeing. This wasn't a dream. The weight of her presence, the faint hum that seemed to emanate from her, was too real. Yet it felt impossible. like a story ripped from the pages of a science fiction novel. As dawn broke, the first rays of sunlight filtered through the window, catching her face. She stirred, her eyes fluttering open. For a moment they locked eyes again, and Nathan felt the same inexplicable pull, like gravity, drawing him into her orbit. She said something, her voice hoarse but musical, and this time she reached out, her fingers brushing his hand. The gesture was tentative, almost shy, but it carried a weight that made Nathan's chest tighten. "I don't understand you," he murmured, "but I'll help you. Whatever you need, I'll help you." Her lips curved into the faintest smile and she nodded. Though no words were exchanged, an unspoken understanding passed between them. Whatever had brought her here, whatever dangers followed, they were bound together now by the threads of fate, spun across the vastness of the stars. And Nathan knew, deep in his soul, that his life would never be the same again. Morning broke over the quiet forest, its light soft and golden, filtering through the dense canopy of trees. Inside Nathan's cabin, the atmosphere was anything but serene. Lyra, as Nathan had come to call her, sat curled on the edge of the couch, her luminous eyes wide and wary. Nathan had spent the hours since dawn pacing, his mind a whirlwind of questions. Every so often he glanced at her, half expecting her to vanish into thin air, as if her presence was some fleeting hallucination. But she was real achingly, impossibly real. The faint hum of her presence filled the room, an undercurrent of energy that made the air feel alive. She had spent the night regaining her strength, and now she seemed more alert, though her posture remained tense, guarded. On the small coffee table between them lay a peculiar device, a smooth, oval object that pulsed faintly with an inner light. It was part of what she had salvaged from her crash, and after some hesitation, she had activated it. The device emitted a low vibration, and a thin beam of light projected into the air, displaying symbols and patterns Nathan couldn't decipher. He had watched in fascinated silence as Lyra manipulated the device, her slender fingers moving with fluid precision. When the light flickered and transformed into coherent words in English, his breath caught. "Listen," she said at last, her voice soft but laced with urgency. The word came slowly, as if she had plucked it from the air and tested its weight before speaking. She gestured to the light, which now hovered like a hologram between them. Nathan leaned closer, captivated. The hologram shifted, displaying an image of a planet. It was breathtaking, swirling hues of violet and silver clouds wrapped around a crystalline surface, dotted with sprawling cities that sparkled like constellations. Lyra's gaze softened as she stared at it, a longing flickering in her eyes that Nathan could feel as much as see. "This is Aura," she said, her voice carrying a melodic cadence, even as the translation device smoothed the edges. "My home." Nathan swallowed hard, his mind grappling with the enormity of what she was telling him. Another planet. Another civilization. And she was here, sitting on his couch, impossibly far from the world she called home. "I was forced to leave," she continued, her tone darkening. The hologram shifted again, this time showing a figure tall and imposing, cloaked in shadow. His features were sharp and angular, a twisted mirror of Lyra's elegance. "My uncle," she said, her voice trembling. "He seeks power above all else. When my parents, our rulers, were lost in an accident, he seized control of the council." Nathan listened, his heart pounding. The light from the hologram bathed the room in an otherworldly glow, making the story feel even more surreal. "I was an obstacle," Lyra continued, her hands gripping the edges of the blanket draped over her shoulders. "As the last of the royal line, I was the key to legitimacy. He wanted me bound to his rule, to marry an ally of his choosing and solidify his power." Her voice cracked, and she paused, as if the weight of the words threatened to crush her. Nathan's chest tightened. He wanted to say something, anything, but he didn't know how to breach the gap between their worlds, their pain. "I refused," she said finally, her voice steadying. "I would not be a pawn in his game, so I fled. But my escape was not unnoticed. I am valuable, not just for who I am, but for what I can do." Nathan tilted his head. "What you can do?" Lyra hesitated, then held up her hand. A soft glow emanated from her palm, and the air around it shimmered. The light coalesced into a delicate shape, a star, intricate and gleaming, floating above her skin. Nathan stared, his breath caught in his throat. "This is a fragment of my power," she said quietly. "On Oris, light is life. It flows through us, connects us to the very core of our planet. I can shape it, harness it, and others want to control it." The star dissolved, fading into the ether, but the memory of it lingered in Nathan's mind, seared there like an imprint on his soul. "And now," Nathan asked, his voice barely above a whisper, "what happens now?" Lyra looked away, her gaze distant. They will come for me. My uncle's reach extends far, even beyond our world. He sent hunters mercenaries bound by loyalty to him. They will not stop until I am found. The weight of her words sank into the room, heavy and suffocating. Nathan felt the enormity of her plight, the desperation that had driven her to cross the stars in search of refuge. But beneath her fear, there was a quiet strength, a resolve that made her seem unbreakable despite her fragile appearance. Why Earth, he asked finally. Of all the places you could have gone, why here? Lyra's gaze met his, and for a moment the vulnerability in her eyes was almost unbearable. Because it is untouched by Aura's politics. It is free. Your world, your people, are not yet entangled in the web of alliances and betrayals that define mine. I thought I could hide here. Nathan felt a pang of guilt. Earth, his unassuming home, was a fragile sanctuary. If her pursuers arrived, if they brought even a fraction of her world's chaos with them, it would shatter. But now I see the danger I've brought to your world, she said, her voice barely audible. I shouldn't have come. Don't say that, Nathan said, the words spilling out before he could stop them. He leaned forward, his voice firm despite the storm raging inside him. You had nowhere else to go. You didn't choose this, it was forced on you. And now that you're here, we'll figure it out. Together. Lyra studied him, her expression unreadable. Then, to his surprise, she reached out, her fingers brushing his. Her touch was cool, almost electric, and it sent a shiver up his spine. You don't have to help me, she said softly, her gaze searching his. You don't even know me, Nathan's jaw tightened. Maybe not. But I know enough. You're in danger. You're alone. That's all I need to know. For the first time, a faint smile ghosted across her lips. It was fleeting, but it carried a warmth that seemed to brighten the room. Thank you, she whispered. For believing me. For not turning away. Nathan didn't respond, but something in his chest shifted, a quiet resolve settling there. Whatever was coming, whatever forces sought to tear her away, he wouldn't let them. Not without a fight. And for the first time in years, as the hologram faded and the room plunged into quiet once more, Nathan felt the stirrings of something he hadn't dared to feel: purpose. The days following Lyra's revelation were a delicate dance of discovery and discord. Nathan quickly learned that living with an alien princess wasn't just a matter of hiding her presence from the world. It was about navigating the collision of two entirely different worlds. Every interaction was a reminder of how vast the gap was between them, and yet within that chasm, sparks of understanding began to flicker. Lyra's curiosity was unrelenting. She roamed Nathan's small cabin with the wonder of a child in an enchanted castle, marveling at the most mundane objects. She spent hours examining the toaster, fascinated by how it transformed bread into crisp warmth, and nearly dismantled his weather station when she mistook it for a form of Earth art. Nathan tried explaining each item's purpose, but her questions came faster than he could answer. This tea, she asked one evening, holding a steaming mug with both hands, her violet eyes wide with curiosity. Is it sacred? Your people drink it with such reverence. Nathan chuckled, his lips quirking into a smile. Not sacred, it's just comforting. Something warm to hold on to when the world feels cold. Lyra tilted her head, her luminous hair catching the glow of the fire. Then perhaps it is sacred, she mused, sipping the tea thoughtfully. In a way you do not see. Her words lingered with him, an echo of her unique perspective that both challenged and enriched his own. But not every interaction was so harmonious. Lyra's instincts, honed by a life of royal privilege and survival, clashed sharply with Nathan's earthly sensibilities. Privacy, for instance, was a concept she struggled to grasp. One morning, Nathan awoke to find her perched on the edge of his bed, staring at him with an intensity that sent a jolt of adrenaline through his veins. Lyra, he groaned, sitting up and rubbing his face. What are you doing? I heard your breathing change, she replied matter-of-factly. Your body was in distress. I came to help. Nathan blinked, bewildered. I was snoring. Her brow furrowed. This is an affliction. Not exactly, he muttered, stifling a laugh. It's just normal. Next time, maybe wait outside. Her confusion deepened. But she nodded. If that is your custom. Their misunderstandings often spiraled into unintentional humor. She tried to mimic his behavior to blend in, but her interpretations were hilariously off-mark. When Nathan offered her a handshake, she responded by grasping his arm in a regal Oris gesture, leaving him awkwardly dangling. When she saw him salting his food, she sprinkled table salt into her tea, declaring it an acquired taste. Despite the tension, these moments brought levity, chipping away at the walls between them. Yet, the chasm between their worlds wasn't always so easily bridged. One evening, Nathan found Lyra standing at the edge of the lake, her silhouette illuminated by the silvery glow of her skin, She was manipulating light, weaving it into delicate patterns that shimmered like constellations. It was breathtaking, but Nathan's awe was tinged with unease. "Lyra," he called out, his voice cautious as he approached. "You can't do that out here. Someone might see." Her hands faltered, the patterns dissolving into the night. She turned to face him, her expression a mix of confusion and hurt. "Why must I hide what I am?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Do you fear me too?" Nathan sighed, running a hand through his hair. "It's not about fear, it's about safety, for both of us." Her gaze softened, but her frustration was palpable. "On Oris, my light is my identity. To suppress it feels wrong, as if I am losing myself." He stepped closer, his tone gentle but firm. "I get it. I do. But here, people wouldn't understand. They'd see you as a threat. And if they find out, Lyra, I can't protect you from that." The words hung between them, heavy and unspoken. Lyra nodded, though the resignation in her eyes made Nathan's chest ache. Despite these moments of tension, their bond grew in quiet, unexpected ways. Nathan taught her Earth's simple pleasures: how to roast marshmallows over a fire, how to skip stones across the lake, and how to identify constellations in the night sky. She, in turn, shared fragments of her world, describing the crystalline cities of Oris that shimmered beneath twin suns and the breathtaking light ceremonies that united her people in collective harmony. One evening, as they sat by the fire, she turned to him, her voice barely above a whisper. "Do you ever wonder what it would be like to leave this world?" The question caught him off guard. He stared at her, the firelight dancing in her eyes, before replying. "I've thought about it. But Earth, it's all I've ever known. I wouldn't even know where to start." Lyra smiled faintly. "Perhaps that is why I came here, to start anew, to find a place where I could simply be." Her vulnerability struck a chord in Nathan. He reached out, his hand brushing hers, and though she tensed at first, she didn't pull away. They sat like that, the silence between them no longer heavy, but comforting. The turning point came one stormy night. Thunder rumbled in the distance as rain lashed against the cabin windows. Lyra, drawn to the storm's raw energy, stood by the window, her expression alight with wonder. Nathan, however, was preoccupied, typing furiously at his laptop as he monitored the storm's trajectory. "Why do you study this?" she asked, her voice cutting through the rhythm of the rain. "The storms. The chaos. What do you hope to find?" Nathan hesitated, his fingers pausing over the keyboard. He turned to her, his face shadowed by an emotion she couldn't quite place. "Control," he admitted. "Answers. Something to make the unpredictability of it all make sense." Lyra tilted her head. "And has it brought you peace?" Her question hit him like a punch to the gut. He laughed bitterly, shaking his head. "Not really. But it's all I know how to do." She moved toward him, her steps deliberate. "Nathan," she said softly, her hand resting on his shoulder, "you cannot control the storm. You can only weather it. Perhaps. It is not the answers that matter, but the journey to find them." Her words disarmed him, stripping away layers of doubt he hadn't even realized he was carrying. He looked at her, and for the first time, he allowed himself to truly see her not as an alien, not as a fugitive, but as someone who understood him in a way no one else ever had. By the time the storm passed, something had shifted between them. The barriers of culture and custom, of fear and misunderstanding, no longer felt insurmountable. They were two souls adrift in the vastness of existence, but somehow they had found each other. And as they sat in the quiet aftermath, their hands entwined, Nathan knew one thing for certain: he was no longer alone. The first sign of trouble came with the storm. Nathan had been studying weather patterns for years, and he knew the rhythms of the earth like the back of his hand. He could read the wind, the clouds, the pressure shifts, and he could feel when something was wrong. The storm rolling in that evening wasn't like anything he'd seen before. It wasn't just the speed at which it gathered, or the intensity of the lightning that splintered the sky. It was the silence before the first strike. A silence so deep it felt like the world itself was holding its breath. Lyra stood on the porch, her silver hair catching the faint light of the approaching storm. Her eyes were fixed on the horizon, her posture tense. She hadn't said much that day, her usual curiosity dampened by an unspoken tension. Nathan, who had grown accustomed to her ceaseless questions and quiet marvel at his world, noticed the change immediately. "What is it?" he asked, stepping out onto the porch. The air felt charged, alive with energy. "You've been on edge all day." She didn't answer right away. Her gaze remained locked on the storm clouds, their dark mass roiling with an unnatural urgency. When she finally spoke, her voice was low, tinged with a fear Nathan had never heard from her before. "They're here." Nathan's stomach sank. Who? The hunter, she said, turning to face him. Her eyes, usually so calm and otherworldly, were now wide with dread. They found me. The words hit him like a punch to the chest. He wanted to deny it, to tell her she was mistaken, but the look in her eyes stopped him. Lyra didn't deal in paranoia or exaggeration. If she said they were here, it was because she knew. He stepped closer to her, lowering his voice as if the storm could somehow overhear them. How do you know? She gestured toward the sky. The storm is not natural. It is them. They can manipulate the atmosphere to track my energy signature. They're closing in. Nathan felt his blood turn to ice. The storm, with its eerie silence and unnatural ferocity, was their doing. He glanced back at the cabin, its warm light spilling onto the porch. It felt like a fragile haven, suddenly inadequate against the looming threat. What do we do? He asked, his voice steady despite the rising panic in his chest. Lyra's jaw tightened. We run. It wasn't until they were deep in the forest, the storm chasing them like a predator, that Nathan fully grasped the scale of what they were up against. The rain lashed at them, soaking their clothes and turning the ground into treacherous mud. The wind howled, whipping branches into a frenzy, but the unnatural rhythm of the storm was the least of his concerns. Above them, flashes of light broke through the canopy, too sharp and precise to be lightning. Nathan risked a glance upward and saw something that made his breath catch a sleek black vessel cutting through the clouds, its surface shimmering as if cloaked in some kind of energy field. It moved with a predatory grace, scanning the ground with beams of pale, searching light. They won't stop, Lyra said, her voice barely audible over the storm. She gripped his arm, her strength surprising despite her slight frame. We have to keep moving. Nathan nodded, his fear eclipsed by a fierce determination to protect her. This way, he said, leading her toward a narrow trail that snaked deeper into the woods. He knew these forests better than anyone. If they could stay ahead of the hunters long enough, maybe they could lose them. The forest was alive with tension. Every crack of a branch, every rustle of leaves, felt like the herald of their pursuers. Nathan's mind raced, calculating their chances, planning their next move. Lyra's breathing was steady beside him, but he could feel her fear like a tangible force, pressing against him. They reached a shallow ravine, the rain turning its rocky bed into a torrent. Nathan hesitated, glancing at Lyra. Can you make it? She nodded, but her expression betrayed her doubt. Before she could argue, he grabbed her hand. Come on, he said, leading her down the slippery slope. They stumbled together, half sliding to the bottom, the freezing water biting at their legs as they crossed. Behind them, the storm seemed to intensify. Nathan glanced back and saw one of the beams of light sweep across the treetops, illuminating the rain like a curtain of diamonds. His heart pounded. They were getting closer. By the time they reached a cluster of rocky outcroppings, Nathan was gasping for breath, his lungs burning from the exertion. Lyra, though winded, seemed eerily composed, her glowing skin flickering faintly in the darkness. She pressed her hand against the rock face, her expression distant, as if listening to something Nathan couldn't hear. They're splitting up, she said, suddenly her voice sharp with urgency. They'll flank us. Nathan cursed under his breath. He scanned the area, searching for anything they could use to their advantage. His eyes landed on a narrow crevice in the rock, barely wide enough for them to squeeze through. In here, he said, pulling her toward it. The space was cramped and cold, but it offered cover. They pressed themselves against the jagged walls, their breaths shallow as they listened. The rain outside was deafening, masking the sounds of their pursuers, but Nathan's ears strained for any hint of movement. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. Nathan's muscles ached from the tension, his heart hammering in his chest. He turned to Lyra, her face illuminated by the faint glow of her skin. She was staring past him, her expression unreadable. What is it? He whispered. They're close, she murmured. Her hand moved to the pendant she always wore, a crystalline shard that pulsed faintly with light. If they find us, I'll have to fight. Nathan shook his head. No, we'll find another way. There may not be one, she said, her voice heavy with resignation. She turned to him, her gaze piercing. I won't let them take you too. Her words sent a chill through him. But before he could respond, a sound cut through the storm, a low, mechanical hum, growing louder by the second. Nathan's breath caught. The hunters were here. The next moments blurred into chaos. A burst of light illuminated the crevice as one of the hunters' drones swept past, its energy beam scanning the rocks. Nathan pulled Lyra closer, shielding her with his body as the beam lingered, its hum vibrating through the air. Then, as suddenly as it had come, the drone moved on. The forest fell eerily silent, the storm's roar fading into the background. Nathan exhaled shakily, his grip on Lyra tightening. "They're still searching," she whispered. Her voice was calm, but he could see the tension in her every movement. "We'll make it," Nathan said, his voice firm despite the fear clawing at his chest. "We just have to stay ahead of them." Lyra met his gaze, her eyes shimmering with an emotion he couldn't quite name. "Thank you," she said softly. "For not giving up." Nathan's jaw tightened. "I won't," he said. "Not now. Not ever." As the storm raged on, they prepared to move again, their bond stronger than ever. Danger loomed like a shadow over them, but within that darkness, a fragile hope flickered. Together, they would face whatever came next, defying the storm and the hunters who pursued them. And for the first time, Nathan realized that he wasn't running just to save Lyra's life, he was running to save his own. The air was electric, humming with tension that made Nathan's skin prickle. They had been running for hours, the relentless pursuit of the hunters pressing closer with every step. The storm, a harbinger of danger, seemed to churn overhead, its unnatural energy echoing the turmoil within them. But now there was no more room to run. They had reached the edge of a desolate quarry, its jagged cliffs plunging into a yawning abyss. Lyra stood at the precipice, her silver hair whipping in the wind, her glowing skin casting an ethereal light on the dark stone. Nathan could see the resolve in her posture, the quiet strength that had carried her across the stars. But there was also weariness and exhaustion born not just of the chase, but of the weight she carried. Behind them, the sound of the hunters grew louder. Nathan turned, his heart pounding as a sleek, black craft descended through the storm, its lights slicing through the rain. Figures emerged, their forms shrouded in dark, shimmering armor that seemed to ripple like liquid. They moved with an unnerving precision, spreading out to encircle them. Lyra stepped forward, her voice steady but laced with defiance. "You've come far enough," she called, her words cutting through the storm. "Turn back now and I will spare you." The leader of the hunters stepped forward, his helmet reflecting the flickering light of the storm. His voice, distorted and cold, carried an edge of cruelty. "You know we cannot do that, Princess. Your uncle's orders are clear. Come with us, and this can end without bloodshed." Lyra's eyes narrowed. "There is no bloodshed because I refuse to spill it, not because I fear you." Nathan's fists clenched at his sides. He wanted to protect her, to stand between her and the danger closing in, but he knew this was beyond him. He had no weapons, no way to fight beings whose technology and power dwarfed anything he could comprehend. All he could do was stay close, ready to act if an opportunity arose. Lyra turned her head slightly, just enough to meet Nathan's gaze. "Stay behind me," she murmured. Her voice was calm, but there was an urgency in her eyes. "No matter what happens, don't interfere." "I'm not leaving you," he said firmly. Her lips curved into the faintest of smiles. "I know." The lead hunter raised a hand, and the other figures moved forward, their weapons glowing with an ominous light. Lyra took a deep breath, and the faint glow of her skin brightened, spreading outward until it surrounded her like a shimmering aura. Nathan felt the energy in the air shift, a pulse of raw power that made the hairs on his arms stand on end. "You've made your choice," the hunter said, his voice tinged with something that might have been regret. "So be it." In a flash, the hunters attacked. Bolts of energy erupted from their weapons, slicing through the storm with blinding intensity. Lyra moved like a tempest, her hands weaving patterns of light that deflected the blasts, sending them arcing harmlessly into the ground. The glow around her intensified, taking on the shape of a shield that pulsed with each attack. Nathan watched in awe, his fear momentarily eclipsed by the sheer beauty of her power. Lyra wasn't just fighting, she was creating, her movements an intricate dance that turned destruction into art. The hunters pressed closer, their precision deadly, but Lyra held her ground, her light growing brighter with each moment. One of the hunters broke through her defenses, lunging toward her with a blade that crackled with energy. Nathan's instincts took over. Before he could think, he surged forward, tackling the hunter to the ground. The impact sent a jolt of pain through his shoulder, but he didn't care. He scrambled to his feet, grabbing a fallen weapon and pointing it at the downed figure. "Stay down," he shouted, his voice shaking but firm. The hunter hesitated, their visor reflecting Nathan's determined face. Before they could react, Lyra's light flared, and the weapon in Nathan's hands melted into harmless shards. He turned to see her staring at him, her expression a mix of frustration and gratitude. "I told you to stay back," she said, her voice firm but not unkind. Nathan shrugged, a crooked grin on his face. "Guess I'm not great at following orders." The battle raged on, each second stretching into eternity. Lyra's light was blinding now, a beacon that cut through the storm and lit up the quarry like a second sun. She was holding her own, but Nathan could see the strain in her movements, the way her breath hitched with every attack she deflected. The hunters closed in for a final strike, their weapons charging with a sickly green light. Lyra raised her hands, the air around her vibrating with energy. Nathan knew this was at the moment she had been preparing for, the moment she feared. With a cry that seemed to echo across the stars, Lyra unleashed her power. The light around her erupted outward in a wave, consuming the hunters in a blinding burst. The ground shook, the air crackled, and then there was silence. Nathan blinked, his vision swimming from the intensity of the blast. When his eyes adjusted, he saw Lyra standing at the center of the quarry, her glow dimmed but still present. The hunters were gone, their forms dissolved into the ether, their weapons scattered and lifeless. Nathan ran to her, his heart in his throat. She was trembling, her breath coming in ragged gasps, but she was alive. He reached out, his hands steadying her as she swayed on her feet. "Lyra," he said, his voice breaking. "You did it." She looked up at him, her eyes filled with exhaustion and relief. "It's over," she whispered. "For now." Nathan pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly as the storm began to dissipate. The world felt still, the air heavy with the aftermath of what had just happened. Lyra's light flickered softly, a reminder of her strength and resilience. But as they stood there, the reality of what they had faced settled over them. The hunters might have been defeated, but the fight was far from over. They had won this battle, but the war, the fight for her freedom, for her future, was just beginning. Together, they would face whatever came next, their bond stronger than ever, forged in the fire of their shared struggle. And for the first time, Nathan felt not fear, but hope. The air after the battle felt different, as though the storm had scoured the world clean. The once ominous sky now stretched vast and clear, a deep, endless blue streaked with soft clouds. Nathan and Lyra stood at the edge of the quarry, their bodies battered, their spirits raw, but their hearts alight with a strange, bittersweet hope. Lyra's glow had dimmed to a faint shimmer, her energy spent. She leaned lightly against Nathan, her breath shallow but steady. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The silence was no longer heavy with fear, but instead brimming with unspoken emotion. "They'll come again," she said finally, her voice soft but resolute. "My uncle won't stop until I'm back under his control. I've delayed the inevitable, but this world is no longer safe. For me. For you." Nathan turned to her, his jaw tightening. "You don't have to do this alone. We can find another way." Lyra shook her head, a sad smile touching her lips. "Your world wasn't meant to bear the weight of mine. If I stay, I will bring ruin. But if I leave," she hesitated, her gaze flickering to the horizon. "I can fight. I can take back what he stole. Not just for me, but for my people." Nathan's chest tightened. He wanted to argue, to beg her to stay, but he knew the truth of her words. Her presence on Earth was a fragile miracle, one that could shatter under the weight of the dangers she carried with her. He swallowed hard, his voice low. "So this is goodbye." "Not forever," she said, her eyes meeting his. "I promise you that." The hours that followed passed in a blur. Lyra worked tirelessly to repair the last piece of her damaged technology, a sleek, crystalline beacon salvaged from her crash. Nathan watched her, his heart heavy with the realization that this moment was slipping through his fingers. He wanted to memorize every detail, the way her hair caught the sunlight, the soft hum of her energy as it flowed through the beacon, the quiet determination in her every movement. When the beacon activated, a pulse of light shot into the sky, brighter than the sun. Nathan shielded his eyes, but Lyra didn't flinch. She stood tall, her silhouette outlined by the radiant glow. The signal, she explained, would reach her allies on Oris, a hidden resistance fighting against her uncle's tyranny. They would come for her, take her back to where she was needed most. As they waited, the world seemed to hold its breath. The minutes stretched endlessly, every second weighed down by the inevitability of her departure. "Here," Nathan said, breaking the silence. He held out a small object, something he had carved from wood during the hours they had spent hiding. It was a simple star, rough around the edges but carefully made, its points uneven yet sincere. Lyra took it, her fingers brushing his, and for a moment neither of them moved. "What is this?" she asked, her voice tinged with curiosity. "A promise," he said, his voice tight with emotion. "That no matter how far apart we are, I'll be looking up at the same stars, thinking of you." Her fingers curled around the star, holding it as if it were the most precious thing in the universe. Her gaze softened, and for the first time since the battle, her lips curved into a smile that reached her eyes. "Then I'll keep it close," she said, "to remind me of this place. Of you." When the ship arrived, it was unlike anything Nathan had imagined. A massive, crystalline structure descended silently from the sky, its form shifting and refracting light like a living prism. The air vibrated with its presence, a low, resonant hum that seemed to echo in his very bones. Lyra turned to him, her expression unreadable. "This is where I go," she said softly, "where I fight for what's right. But, Nathan, meeting you, knowing you has changed me. It's shown me a strength I didn't know I had." Nathan swallowed the lump in his throat. "You've changed me too," he said. "More than I can ever put into words." For a moment, time seemed to freeze. Then, without hesitation, Lyra stepped forward and placed her hands on either side of his face. Her touch was cool, electric, and when her lips brushed his, it was like the stars themselves had descended to Earth. The kiss was brief but searing, a promise and a farewell all at once. Lyra stepped back, her glow intensifying as the ship's light enveloped her. She hesitated, as if lingering on the edge of a decision she couldn't bring herself to make. "Nathan," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "This isn't the end. I will find my way back to you, no matter how long it takes." He nodded, his throat too tight to speak. The words he wanted to say, "Stay, I love you, don't go," clung to his chest like lead. Instead, he forced a smile, one that carried all the hope and strength he could muster. "I'll be here," he said. "Always." As the light consumed her, Lyra raised her hand, the wooden star still clutched tightly. Then, with a final pulse of brilliance, she was gone. The ship ascended, disappearing into the endless expanse of the sky, leaving behind only silence and a faint shimmer of light. Nathan stood there for a long time, staring at the place where she had vanished. The world around him felt achingly empty, the weight of her absence pressing down like a stone. But as he looked up, his gaze finding the stars above, he felt a flicker of hope. Somewhere out there, across the vastness of space, Lyra was fighting for her world, for herself, and for a future where they could meet again. Years passed, but Nathan never stopped looking up. He carried her memory with him, a constant presence in his heart. And then, one fateful night as he stood by the lake where they had first met, a streak of light cut across the sky. It wasn't a meteor, he knew that instantly. It was something else, something extraordinary. A smile broke across his face, his chest swelling with a joy he hadn't felt in years. She was coming back. Against all odds, across all the distance between them, Lyra had kept her promise. And Nathan, his heart racing with anticipation, whispered to the night, "I knew you would."